Welcome, everybody. I'm Day Wilson of FODMAP Everyday. Robin's here facilitating our tech, and we are so excited to be doing this webinar with one of our success team dietitians, Julia Celestini, who's right down there or up there, over there, depending on your view. This has been a long time in coming. At FODMAP Everyday, we address IBS, the low FODMAP diet, and a lot of times information is addressed at adults. And there are a lot of children out there and families with children who range in age from babies to teens, and the approach really needs to be different. And that's why we have a pediatric specialist here. So let me tell you a little bit about Julia. She is a registered pediatric dietitian based in Ontario, Canada, and she works both as a pediatric dietitian at Sick Kids Hospital, as well as through her private practice, which is called Happy Bellies Nutrition. Her focus is on digestive health, and she is always supporting teens and children. So she has developed a one-of-a-kind online group called IBS Gentle. Some of you may have heard the term low FODMAP gentle diet. This is a less restrictive approach to the low FODMAP diet, but it needs to be further tailored for kids and teens and can be part of the way you address IBS in those age groups. So we're going to dive right in. I'm just going to let you know that we will be giving you information as we go along about Julia's program. She has starting July 4th, there is going to be registration starting for her online program that specifically addresses IBS Gentle, and we'll have more about that later. So I'm just going to turn it over to Julia.
Thank you, Day.
So good to have you here.
Thank you. It's so nice to join both of you. And I am very excited for this because it has been a while that we've been planning, and I'm very happy to have everyone who's joining us live, and welcome to those who are watching the recording. So we will get started. And I just wanted to start off with a disclaimer before we get into the webinar, just that this webinar is for educational purposes only, so it's not in place of medical or nutritional advice. So please seek the guidance of your doctor or your child's doctor or registered dietitian for individualized guidance, and that it is designed for parents and caregivers over 18 years old. So we'll get started, and what we'll talk about today is an overview of IBS in children, IBS in children compared to IBS in adults. We'll talk about treatment options for IBS in children. What does IBS gentle strategies mean, and why are they important for kids? We'll talk about my top 5 favorite IBS gentle strategies for kids. And then we will, of course, talk a little bit about the low FODMAP diet. Is it appropriate for kids? And we'll introduce the gentle low FODMAP diet. We'll also leave time for questions throughout the presentation as well as at the end. So definitely let us know in the chat if you have questions, and we also have some questions for you. So I want to keep it casual and also engaging for everybody. So we'll start off with some background information just so we're all on the same page about IBS. So IBS is a functional gastrointestinal disorder, which means that the gut does not function the way that it's supposed to. This is a traditional way that IBS has been described. It is most commonly diagnosed based on clinical symptoms after other gastrointestinal conditions are ruled out. More recently, and as we learn more about IBS and the human body, IBS has been classified as a disorder of the gut-brain axis. This is because of the unique and profound relationship between our gut and our brain. So we'll talk a little bit more about what that actually means. The gut-brain axis means the interaction between our gut and our brain. You might be familiar with the central nervous system or the peripheral nervous system. However, the gut actually has its own nervous system called the enteric nervous system, which I think is quite fascinating. I think a nice way to think about the gut-brain axis and the gut-brain connection is a street. So looking at it as a two-way street. So your gut can affect your mood and your thoughts, and your brain or your mood, thoughts, and stress levels can absolutely affect your gut and digestion. If you've ever think back to a time that you've been very stressed, especially if you are someone with IBS or if your child has IBS, with the disturbed relationship between the gut-brain axis, you're especially sensitive to changes. So if you've ever been stressed or anxious and noticed that your digestion significantly changes, this is part of the reason. So it is one of the most powerful relationships in the human body, and important to remember and think back to the gut-brain axis when we're talking about treatment and management options for IBS.
I just want to interject. I think this is such a great reason why there has to be a pediatric focus, because children cannot always articulate stress, right? Or when they're upset. And so this is so great that you have this system.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so true. And that's what we'll talk about too, is some of the differences between adults and children, where even things like describing butterflies in your stomach, what does that mean? Is that anxiety or is that actually abdominal pain? So a lot of nuances with children, absolutely. And then we will get to my next slide. So of course, looking at IBS in children and adolescents. So IBS is absolutely not a rare phenomenon in children. It is actually one of the most common functional gastrointestinal disorders in children. There's prevalence rates all over the world that really vary, and there's ranges between 3% to 23% of children having IBS, which is quite significant. And there are criteria for diagnosing IBS in children, the Rome-4 criteria, which is very similar to the criteria for adults, but again, different and specific for children. And children can be grouped into subtypes based on their symptoms, which is also really important when we're looking at treatment options. So if you're not familiar with the subtypes of IBS, there's IBS-D, which means that the symptoms that you experience are primarily diarrhea predominant, IBS-C, constipation predominant, IBS-M, which is a mix of both, and then IBS-U if you don't necessarily fit into the other three categories. And of course, IBS can have a very significant impact on a child's quality of life. However, I wanted to highlight, especially for parents and caregivers out there, that to always remember that IBS, to what we currently know in research, does not cause physical damage to the intestines or the body. So when we're looking at symptoms, especially when we're thinking about things like food triggers of IBS symptoms, typically the symptoms will pass within a few days, which is always a nice thing and something to think about, that it's not going to cause damage or be unsafe compared to something like a food allergy or celiac disease. So there is limited research on IBS in children, and we don't know too much about the cause of IBS in children. However, there is a lot of theories and really good research coming out on this. There are only a few studies that look at the treatment options for IBS in children, and especially long-term effects of different treatment options for children, including the low FODMAP diet. However, research is growing. So we now do have some studies on the low FODMAP diet for children, which is really exciting. And we do have studies on other therapies such as gut-directed hypnotherapy, which we will talk about. And there are also really important to remember that there's lots of treatment options discussed online or that might be recommended to you if you're a caregiver of a child who has IBS, but always really important to remember that it might be based on adult research or information and not necessarily specific to children. So always thinking about, is this designed for children or with children in mind? And go back a slide. So we have the symptoms of IBS in children. The symptoms are very similar to symptoms in adults with IBS, but however, as Dede mentioned, it is really difficult for children to describe their symptoms, which does make diagnosis difficult and tricky and can sometimes be delayed. In addition to feeling confusion about what these symptoms mean or just having difficulty describing them, children, especially adolescents and teenagers, might be embarrassed to talk about their symptoms. So for example, if they experience fecal incontinence, it can feel embarrassing to talk about. So I'm a very big supporter and proponent of reducing stigma about talking about things like poops and farts, which might feel weird and embarrassing, but I don't think should be, because it does lead to really important changes for children's health.
Robin, do you have, I know we have some polls for those attending. Is this a good time to put one up? I'm not sure what the topic is of the first one you're putting up.
Yes, I will do this one right now.
Oh, yeah.
So all of you should see a poll, and perhaps you can take time to answer it. It could really help Julia understand who's in the room, what you're dealing with, because of course, the age at which a child is diagnosed with IBS differs. So we can keep an eye on that, and Julia can continue.
Wonderful, thank you. And this is just to supplement the symptoms of IBS in children. So if you're not aware about the general symptoms of IBS, so some of these include gas, bloating and distension, abdominal pain, urgency and fecal incontinence, as well as constipation, diarrhea, or both. Lastly, about symptoms of IBS in children, so they can overlap with other functional pediatric gastrointestinal disorders. So for example, functional abdominal pain or functional constipation. It is really important that if you do feel like your child has symptoms of IBS or you suspect that they have IBS, to go to their doctor to get a diagnosis, to make sure that other causes are ruled out so that you are getting the most accurate treatment options based on the condition that they might have. Oh, and I think we have some results in. Or if we
It's very interesting, right? So 50% of you, right on the line of people who are working with registered dietitians. I'll just say quickly that the two reasons we hear people don't work with a registered dietitian is cost and access. And certainly addressing the latter, we want everyone to know that these days more than ever, registered dietitians are working remotely. You do not necessarily have to find someone in your backyard. And then there's people like Julia who are creating online tools that you can join from anywhere. So we'll follow up with links and information for you. If you are looking for a dietitian, we can certainly help you with that.
Wonderful. And I'm just going to go to the next slide. So treatment options. So they're, in general, from the research that we have for children with IBS, typically a combination of strategies is more likely to help than one strategy alone. I like to frame this, and I believe Data and Robin, you frame this similarly, as a toolbox. So figuring out a combination of strategies that work and figuring out your child's IBS toolbox. So some strategies you might use more than others, but having a combination of strategies to go to, I think, is really helpful versus, you know, just having one thing alone, and it can lead to the most effective treatment response. And treatment should also be tailored to the type of IBS that a child has. So again, the importance of going to your doctor to get a firm diagnosis, because they can also clarify the type of IBS that your child has. And then the treatment options typically can be grouped into 3 pillars. So looking at medication and medical options, psychological treatment options, as well as diet and lifestyle. We'll focus on diet and lifestyle for this webinar, but it's just important to know that there are lots of different options. For medications, definitely talk to your child's doctor, because there's a lot of good research on different medications for IBS in children that can be really effective. And I know I said a combination works well, but I'll probably backtrack to say that sometimes the medications alone might be enough to manage their symptoms without having to make other major changes. There's lots of psychological options out there. So again, looking at that gut-brain axis, treatment options that address the brain of the gut-brain connection. Some examples including gut-directed hypnotherapy, guided imagery, cognitive behavioral therapy, and yoga therapy. And then diet and lifestyle options, which can include fiber modification, the low FODMAP diet, peppermint oil supplements, and probiotics, just to name a few. And then to compare research and IBS treatment in children versus adults. So we have very limited research on children in comparison to IBS in adults, which we have large, high quality research studies and clinical practice guidelines. There's still, in children, they're still growing both physically and psychologically, and there's a lot of developmental stages going on depending on your child's age. And for adults, typically I would say they're fully grown, depending on the age. And malnutrition for children can significantly impact growth and is a really important consideration for kids, which doesn't necessarily impact adults as significantly as it would for a child. And because children are growing and they're still developing their relationship with food and the world around them, they can very quickly develop food fears and picky eating due to IBS symptoms or due to dietary changes that we make for them. And food fears with adults can absolutely exist and are important to look at. However, adults typically are less sensitive because their relationship with food is more established than for children. So we can get into talking about the IBS gentle strategies for kids. So what does a gentle strategy for IBS mean? It is essentially strategies that focus on managing IBS symptoms while avoiding unnecessary food restriction and supporting a positive relationship with food, as well as being generally more simple and trying to aim for less overwhelming strategies for both the child and caregivers. Because a lot of the treatment options, especially when we're looking at the low FODMAP diet, can be very overwhelming. And it is based on research available for children and adults. And I have adapted the ones that we're going to talk about today for children. I also wanted to make very clear that adults can absolutely use these strategies.
I love that you're addressing the caregivers because, you know, obviously children are being guided by the adults and caregivers in their lives. And so they're going to be impacted by what's necessary to follow. And so that's great that you're taking such a holistic approach.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I learned really early on when I started working with kids and in the pediatric space that it's really about the family. And even though you might have an idea or a recommendation for the child, it has to work for everyone because everyone needs to be on board and supported. And what works for one family is definitely not going to work for another family. And we can talk about kind of how we categorize the gentle strategies, which is similar to the treatment options for IBS. So I consider medications an IBS gentle strategy because, again, starting with a medication might allow you to not have to make as many dietary changes or have to make dietary changes at all. However, that is for some. Not everyone would want to do medications, or it might not work for every child. There are lots of different psychological strategies that I think are very interesting and actually do have some really good research. So gut-directed hypnotherapy has a lot of great research behind it. And there are studies looking at children, which is wonderful. And guided imagery is another example of a psychological strategy. Most of the psychological strategies are gentle because they don't look at changing your diet or other changes that can affect your relationship with food. And then we have diet and lifestyle. So we'll talk about the gentle low FODMAP diet, probiotics, and then we'll talk about my 5 favorite gentle strategies today. So my top 5 strategies is actually very hard to pick 5. Otherwise this webinar could be about 2 to 3 hours long. So we can talk about the balanced plate, hydration, fiber modification, meal and snack spacing, as well as diaphragmatic breathing. So the balanced plate, you may or may not have heard of the balanced plate or the concept of eating a balanced diet. So what does that actually mean? It essentially means eating a variety of food at meals and snacks that is similar or might look similar to your country's food guide or food recommendations. And this varies country to country because every country has a very different food guide. The new Canadian food guide looks somewhat similar to this. So this is the balanced plate and snack that I've created. And it is appropriate for children. So for the balanced plate, this is in an ideal world what your child's plate could look like. So half of their plate being color, which is fruits and vegetables. A quarter of their plate being a source of protein with healthy fats. So examples of protein include meat, fish, beans, eggs, and tofu. Fats could include oil, avocado, olives, or butter. And a quarter of their plate complex carbohydrates. So that would be like whole grains, for example. So oats, whole grain pasta, whole grain bread, rice, or pitas. And then also a balanced snack, which I also don't think is talked about as much as a balanced plate, especially for kids, because kids love snacks. I like snacks too, but it's important to treat a snack like a mini meal. So a snack doesn't necessarily have to be non-nutritious. It should be considered as you would plan a meal. So it's still a good source of nutrition. And for a snack, you can pair a complex carbohydrate, which I typically think, in my opinion, children are pretty good at getting. So the fruits or the grains or the granola bars, and pairing it with a protein and a fat. So some examples of this could be, instead of just having an apple with peanut butter, or having an apple with a side of nuts. And then the drink for both of these plates could be water or milk, whatever milk your child drinks. And why? So why is this important? It sounds super simple, but the balance plate really shouldn't be underlooked. In addition to helping your child get all the nutrients they need to grow and thrive, it will also help them feel full and satisfied at meals and snacks. And in terms of IBS, eating a variety of foods at each meal and snack is very helpful for digestion. So our body is not designed to digest a large group of one nutrient or food at a time. It's designed to eat a meal. So it's designed to digest a variety of things at once in more moderate amounts. So an example of this and what this means is that it is easier for the body to digest a piece of toast with peanut butter and sliced banana compared to if you ate 4 pieces of toast at once. So I have some homework for you. So I have an action, and I really like to give actionable strategies so that you can kind of make sense, or what do I do with this information that I'm receiving at this webinar. So what you can do today or this week is take a look at your child's plate and what you're offering them, and think about, are they having a balanced plate? Is there anything that you can do to offer at their meals or snacks to make it more balanced? So not only will this help with their nutrition, it will very much help with their digestion.
And I think, just to interject, I mean, I'm sure, Julia, you hear this all the time. We certainly hear all the time that people, especially new to the diet, think that there are not very many fruits and vegetables that have low FODMAP servings, and nothing could be further from the truth. If you are still at the very beginning of your awareness of the diet, and maybe a gastroenterologist has given you a piece of paper with, you know, yeses and nos or high and low FODMAP choices, you might be only getting a very high level look at the diet. Yeah. And certainly downloading the Monash University smartphone app, the FODMAP friendly smartphone app, you will see you can eat broccoli, you can eat zucchini, you can eat strawberries and grapes and cantaloupe. There's a lot of fruits and vegetables. So when Julia is suggesting half of your plate should be fruits and vegetables, there are choices, absolutely. Now, Robin has just put up another poll and quiz. Oh, because I mentioned the app, great segue. So some of you can take a look at that. You know, all of our RDs, you know, all of us use these apps. They are developed by the primary researchers who developed the diet. These are considered primary research. They are the apps that we support. It's the easiest way for you to look something up. You know, if you're saying to yourself right now, broccoli, I can eat broccoli, right there at the palm of your hand, you can look it up. You will see what a recommended low FODMAP serving size is of broccoli. Excellent. Well, a lot of people, we've got educated people in our group.
Wonderful. Yeah, the apps are amazing. And I'm so impressed by the technology that's coming out, even with the FODMAP scanner. I was so impressed when that came out. With, let's see. And can I close this poll on my screen?
Sure. Yep. Absolutely. Yeah, keep going.
So our second strategy, which I talk about all the time, I feel like I'm always talking about water if I'm not talking about balanced plate or fiber, which we'll also talk about. So hydration is also something that sounds super simple, and you've probably heard before that you need to drink more water. You probably know your child might need to drink more water, but I always like to explain why, especially when it comes to IBS and managing digestive symptoms. So my assumption and my observations have been, and as well as the research that we have, is most of us aren't necessarily drinking enough water to stay hydrated. So the body really needs water, not only to keep us alive and for a lot of our vital body functions, it's very important in digestion. So our body needs both fluid and fiber to form stool or form poops. So fluid plays a role because it helps hydrate your bowels and keeps the food waste running throughout your body smoothly. I like to say like oil in an engine. Fiber travels through the body, partially digested, and actually is what forms most of your stool. So my math here is fiber. If you have fiber, but a good amount of fiber, but not enough fluid, you can actually get really dry, hard stools, which can worsen constipation. Because you have the fiber there, but you don't have the fluid to keep it hydrated and moving. Fluid with not enough fiber can give you drier, harder stools or no stools at all, or very hard to pass stools. The best combination is having enough fluid and having enough fiber, because this gives us happy stools and keeps your bowels happy. So for digestion, it's important for your child to meet their daily fluid requirements. They don't need to drink excess beyond what they need. The first step would be just trying to help them meet their daily fluid goals. Sometimes for some children, drinking in excess isn't necessarily helpful and it can be harmful. The key is to prevent dehydration, keeping the colon hydrated and your engine oiled. So I have some general guidelines about how much water a child should drink. These are based on Canadian data and are general information. So definitely check with your child's doctor or dietitian of how much fluid they would recommend. And fluid needs really vary for each child, as well as different times of the year or based on their activity level. But just to get a general sense and kind of see how your child might compare. And I have another piece of homework. This is one of my favorite tools for children. And it can definitely work for adults as well. But sometimes trying to calculate how much water you're drinking, especially for a child running around, it can be very difficult. So one of the best ways to tell if your child's hydrated is looking at their pee. And you can also teach your child how to do this as well. I have lots of children reporting to me their pee color, which is very cute. So when I first saw this chart, I was quite surprised at what color your pee should be to actually mean hydration. So it should be quite pale yellow. And if you look at the 3 to the 4, which I think a lot of people that I've spoken to at least have land on, it actually is telling you that you're mildly dehydrated. So in a very quick and easy way to keep yourself hydrated, keep an eye on your pee. And if your pee gets darker, just drink a little bit more water, is my rule of thumb. So our third strategy is fiber. So this is definitely one of my favorite topics, in addition to water. Dave, I love that you're drinking your water. All this water talk. So fiber comes from plants. And unlike cows who can fully digest fiber, humans do not have the ability to digest fiber, and it mostly goes to your colon undigested. Undigested fiber is great for us because it feeds healthy gut bacteria, which is a process called fermentation. This is also part of the reasons why humans fart. And the FODMAP Everyday ladies, as well as one of our dietitian members, Tamara, have an amazing article about farts that I love. So I highly encourage reading it if you want to learn more.
Entertaining and informative.
Very entertaining. I loved it. So fiber is really good for your gut. So a lot of times gas can, of course, be really uncomfortable, especially when it comes to IBS, but gas is actually a good sign that you're getting enough fiber in your diet. And the fact of the matter is that most children aren't getting enough fiber. So there are 2 types of fiber, soluble fiber and insoluble fiber. You might benefit for more or less of one of these types of fibers, depending on your subtype of IBS. So that's where it really gets back to getting the accurate diagnosis, understanding what type of IBS your child has, so you can fine tune these things like fiber. And then some examples of foods with fiber. So fruits, vegetables, whole grains, nuts, and seeds. And how much fiber does your child need? So I have, again, some general recommendations for amount of fiber, and this can vary based on your child. So again, check with your child's doctor or dietitian because everyone has very specific fiber requirements, as well as water. Our 4th strategy is about meal and snack spacing. So it is very important, especially for those with sensitive digestive systems, to allow your body to digest each meal and snack before you start eating again. This is very important, like I said, for people with IBS. So grazing, which I find lots of little children love to do, so snacking all day and not giving the body enough time to digest can worsen IBS symptoms. It is important for children to aim for about 2.5 to 4 hours between meals and snacks between eating, depending on your child's age and preferences. So this will vary. And it's also important not to skip meals, so trying not to go beyond 4 hours without eating, especially for a child. Spacing meals also helps your child to have a good appetite, so they eat enough at each meal and snack. If your child is hungry 1 hour after a meal, which I hear a lot from different parents and caregivers that I talk to, so what do you do about this? So some things to think about. or did they have a balanced meal? So going back to the first strategy that we talked about, were they getting a good variety of foods at their meal, or did they just eat a carbohydrate source, which isn't necessarily as filling as if they had those complex carbohydrates with it, or the grains and protein and fat source. So you can look at what they were actually eating. Is there a reason that they didn't eat enough? So for example, were they distracted or were they nervous? Are they just bored, which a lot of us, I am definitely guilty of this, so I don't blame children for this at all, but it's just human nature. So are they bored? Do they want to do something else other than eating? And is there another reason that they might be hungry or asking for food? So just to reflect on this to help with helping your child space out their meals and their snacks. And moving on to our last strategy, so diaphragmatic breathing, which I think is really an awesome strategy and works really well for children. So it's also called big, deep belly breaths, which is a mouthful. It's an exercise technique that's used to help use your diaphragm correctly when you're breathing. So a lot of times at rest or when we're stressed, we're not actually breathing fully and using our lungs to their full capacity. And it is a relaxation technique that's commonly used for IBS. So here are some benefits. So it's proposed to help reduce anxiety, increase energy levels, improve concentration, improve sleep, decrease fatigue, increase sense of self-confidence, reduce muscle tension, and of course, most notably, improve IBS symptoms. So there are a lot of good resources online if you want to look at how to actually do diaphragmatic breathing. And I have one last piece of homework for you, to try 3 big deep belly breaths with your child before their next meal. And you can make a practice of this, include the whole family. It's good for everyone to do, especially in our busy world where we're always running around. It's a nice way to kind of set the tone for the meal. And that reviews all of our gentle strategies. So I wanted to give an opportunity if anyone had any questions about what we've talked about so far.
This is great. I love the slides. You have this so well organized. And I did notice while we're waiting for some questions to come in that the majority of people do have the Monash app, but not the FODMAP friendly app. So I just thought I would address that while we're waiting. So I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about even who FODMAP friendly is. So just to let everyone know, researchers at Monash University developed the diet. At the time, there was a woman named Sue Shepard on that team. She ended up leaving Monash and started FODMAP friendly. So when we say that Monash researchers developed the diet, they did, but they included Sue and she started FODMAP friendly. So these are the 2 entities that are considered primary resources. They are the 2 apps and entities that are doing the lab testing of raw ingredients, of prepared foods, and publishing the results. And we love both of them because they each have slightly different focus. There are many more prepared foods lab tested by FODMAP friendly. There's more raw ingredients lab tested by Monash. So we absolutely use them together. Sometimes they do not agree, which can throw people's brains into a tizzy. And I understand that. We have some articles that address that. Simply put, they both have reputable lab testing procedures. And what they are reporting on is what they lab tested at that moment. The lab tests are snapshots in time. So the blueberries that FODMAP friendly was lab testing are different from the blueberries that Monash was testing, and the blueberries that you buy today will be different yet again. So we look at all of these resources as information that we can use to begin our personal or our children's personal exploration, their relationship to FODMAPs. Your results may not be exactly what the lab tests say. Doesn't mean the lab tests are wrong. We always suggest that you listen to your body and work with your dietitian, and they can help you figure out what is right for you or your child, which is going to be unique. So tell us, while we're waiting for questions, people, you can, pop up in the chat. Tell us a little more about what's happening on July 4th, about this program that you're starting.
Yes, thank you, JD. I'm very excited for this program. I've been working on it since I started in this space because I very quickly, after I started working with FODMAPs and working with children with IBS, realized how limited the resources specifically for children are, and especially looking at a more gentle approach that is perfectly appropriate for children, that doesn't have to be as involved as the traditional low FODMAP diet or traditional approaches to IBS that are usually tailored to adults. So I thought about, and similar to what you said, Dede, earlier about access to dietitians that focus on this area being a really big barrier, as well as cost for individuals who want a dietitian or see the benefit of dietitian, but don't think that this might be an option for them. So I was able to create a program that is available worldwide so that anyone in the world can join. And it's all focused on IBS gentle strategies. So similar to what we talked about today, but diving into lots of different detail and taking the group that will have step-by-step through IBS gentle strategies to navigate and manage IBS symptoms while limiting changes that need to be made, and also really focusing on keeping a positive relationship with food.
So we'll have all of everyone who's here. We're going to be following up with newsletters, emails. We'll have all the information that you need about registering for that. We do have some questions that came in. So Mimi wants to know, how do you handle a teen who refuses to eat fruits and vegetables and doesn't even like smoothies?
It's a great question. And Mimi, your teen is not alone in that. It's something that we see a lot, and this is where talking about gentle strategies, if your teen has digestive symptoms, I'm sure it's hard to imagine, how do I change their diet when they're already limited in terms of not eating fruits and vegetables, for example. In terms of addressing how to help them eat more fruits and vegetables, you could work with a dietitian because it is quite a stepwise process, and it's not usually something that changes overnight. So it's important for you to feel supported as the caregiver is usually one of the main focuses. And how do you navigate those tricky situations while supporting your teenager, but also keeping, yourself not frustrated, because it can be super frustrating if you try and prepare all these things. Some quick tips that I can give you that's not really related to FODMAP, but just related to nutrition for teens, is maybe trying to let them take control. So similar to what I talked about of teenagers and children really liking control or having choices. So seeing if there's one single fruit or vegetable in the world that they might be open to try, or that they want to think about it and pick one and see if that might work, or if they want to get more involved. They might not be interested right now, but maybe in a little while they might be interested in trying to prepare things on their own. I find that can be a really good strategy for teenagers. I previously held, I don't do them right now, but cooking classes. So sometimes too, just seeing if they might be interested, maybe this isn't your teen, but seeing if they might be interested in something outside of your own kitchen. But if they want to do cooking classes or cooking camp, when a teenager makes something themselves, they're almost 99% sure to at least try it, even if they don't like it, just taking the pressure away from finishing the whole thing, of even just exploring and trying and focusing on that.
Do you have more slides? Are we going to move forward with more slides? Or
more slides? So
okay, I'll just answer one more question. So Christy asks, is FODMAP Friendly tested in Australia or US? So FODMAP Friendly uses a third-party independent lab in Australia. Monash does in-house testing in Australia and recently added a lab in the US. So you kind of have a panoply of approaches to how each handles it. All right, why don't we go on with the slides? We can have more questions in a bit.
Wonderful. So yeah, keep asking questions if you have any, and we'll have time at the end. So we'll talk about the low FODMAP diet a little bit more. So a lot of parents and caregivers ask me about the low FODMAP diet for children, which is a great question. And we'll talk about what the low FODMAP diet is for those of you who might not know, and then specifically for children. So the traditional low FODMAP diet is a 3-phase structured diet that's designed for those with IBS and shows a lot of effectiveness in research as well as in clinical experience. there's 3 stages of this diet. So the first stage being the low FODMAP stage, where you reduce your intake of these things called FODMAPs, which we'll go over on the next slide, for a certain period of time. And then you reintroduce FODMAPs one at a time for the different types of FODMAPs, and almost like a little test of your tolerance to these different FODMAPs. So you test the FODMAPs to see what you tolerate as well as what you might not tolerate. And then with that information, you work with your dietitian to expand your diet. So you would limit the foods that you don't tolerate. And then the nice thing about this diet, which I love, is that you get to expand the foods that you do tolerate and that don't exacerbate your IBS symptoms. So the whole role of this diet is to manage IBS symptoms. And I have our FODMAP acronym. So FODMAP is quite a mouthful. And FODMAP essentially is a group of fermentable or gas-producing carbohydrates. The acronym stands for fermentable oligosaccharides, disaccharides, monosaccharides, and polyols. So all you need to know is that it's a group of carbohydrates. And as Dede mentioned, they test food. So Monash and FODMAP Friendly have a testing process of foods to identify which foods have FODMAPs. So that's where it can be super overwhelming, because we'll talk about what foods have FODMAPs. So see at the bottom of the slide. So things like apples, pears, peaches, mushroom, garlic, onion, wheat, milk, and legumes. And then when you look at low FODMAP foods, it can be very confusing, because when you just look at the list, there's no rhyme or reason to what's low FODMAP and what's high FODMAP. It really all comes down to the testing. It is designed to be followed with the support of a low FODMAP trained dietitian. And although it can be very effective, the diet ultimately, it can be complicated. So the food lists are extensive. So if you have one of those food lists that you might have received from your doctor, like Dede mentioned, it can be quite long and overwhelming when you start looking at the amount of foods that are high FODMAP. And apps, although I do think they are great and it does take some time to get used to them, some people do find them really complicated and they might not work for everyone. So my question for those of you joining us live is, has your child tried the traditional low FODMAP diet, or have you heard of it for children? And were there any challenges that you faced?
While we're waiting for that, I think that one thing that we talk about every day in our Facebook groups is reinforcing that this diet is a low FODMAP diet, whether you're looking at a gentle approach or the traditional approach. It's not a no FODMAP diet. So a lot of times when people are brand new and they see a product that maybe has garlic in it, but it's the last ingredient, or it has something else in it that they think in their mind is a high FODMAP ingredient, and yet a dietitian or an app or someone is telling them that there is a low FODMAP serving size. There can be. It all comes down to serving sizes. The diet is very related to serving sizes. I think avocado is a huge one, right? People think that they can't have any avocado, but at least 30 grams, which is a sizable serving, is considered a low FODMAP serving size. So we actually have an article called High FODMAP Foods with Low FODMAP Serving Sizes, which can be very helpful.
Absolutely, it is. It's so important, because sometimes having like that small amount of food that you really like, even if it's a smaller portion of it, really helps to maintain the diet and to stick with it, because otherwise you just could feel very deprived of the foods that you want.
Exactly. And we have in our article, we show you what 30 grams of avocado looks like. And actually it's like 4 slices, fanned out on, sourdough toast, or it's, like a hefty 2 tablespoons of guacamole. I mean, that could be a snack for you or your child. So nobody's answering our question. So nobody perhaps has tried the traditional low FODMAP diet yet for their child. Not really sure.
Yeah, and
we can go on. If people answer, we can come back to that.
For sure. And one thing too is that I do think a lot of parents with children with IBS might not know that there is options like the low FODMAP diet. So hopefully if you're someone who hadn't learned about it, that if this is your first time learning about it, I'm very happy. That's awesome. So we'll talk about some of the pitfalls of the traditional low FODMAP diet, and this is specifically especially looking at with children. So it can be complicated and overwhelming, and it isn't traditionally designed with a focus on children. Children might not be able or willing to follow the diet. So similar maybe to what you mentioned with the fruits and vegetables, every child is very different, and teens and children love flexibility and choice. Typically, the fewer rules, the better. So compliance can be a big challenge with the low FODMAP diet. Portions are not always relevant or appropriate for children. So some of the portions that are recommended might need to be smaller for children, but that can also be addressed when you work with a dietitian. There is a risk for nutritional deficiencies and growth faltering with any sort of elimination diet for a child. They're very sensitive, and it can be overly restrictive. So for example, if your child is a picky eater and then you layer on a low FODMAP diet, it might be too much dietary restriction for your child. And as we talked about, children are in different developmental stages and are very sensitive in terms of their relationship with food, so they can very quickly develop food fears. And that's where it goes back to even what Day mentioned just before about that it's not a no FODMAP diet and it's not a complete elimination, that it's just a low FODMAP diet and then the eventual reintroduction. The language is really important when talking to children about these sort of changes. So the traditional low FODMAP diet can absolutely work well for some children. So we definitely see success and it works really well. And it's just important to know that it doesn't work for all children. So you might be asking me, what do I do if this isn't going to work and it's effective now? What do I do? So there is a really great option that we already mentioned earlier about the gentle low FODMAP diet. And it has been around for quite a while. It's just not as talked about as the traditional low FODMAP diet. The gentle low FODMAP diet is essentially a simplified version of the traditional low FODMAP diet. It follows the same 3-phase approach to identify dietary triggers, and it only eliminates the very high FODMAP foods. So it's a smaller list than you might see with the traditional diet. And as we talked about, the foods have various amount of FODMAP. So some foods have a moderate amount, some foods are high, and some are very high. So we're looking at those very high FODMAP foods to target as a first step. And if you follow this diet for your child, it's still important to work with a dietitian. We have our lovely low FODMAP gentle food list. We recently came out with an article that we collaborated on about the low FODMAP gentle diet for kids. And I personally think if you've seen the other list, this list is a lot more digestible compared to the other lists. So this looks at some examples of the high FODMAP foods to limit, and then we give examples of low FODMAP foods. So what I tell families is if it's not on the left column of the high FODMAP foods, your child can eat it. So those are the only rules. It's just looking at the high FODMAP foods and limiting them, and then allowing your child to eat anything outside of the foods that they're limiting. So some examples would be grain, so looking at wheat and rye-based products, but important to know that it's not all wheat, that there is wheat that is low FODMAP, such as sourdough products, rice, quinoa, and corn are other examples of grains that you could substitute. Vegetables, so onion, garlic, leek, cauliflower, mushrooms. This, I find the mushrooms and cauliflower especially doesn't seem to be a huge issue with most children, but you never know, every child has their own preferences. Some fruits include apples, pears, dried fruit, stone fruit, and watermelon, and then lactose-containing milk and yogurt, as well as legumes and beans.
And again, just to reiterate, the gentle approach is really for two big reasons, right? It's for emotional, mental, as well as physical. So in other words, you might find, or your child might find, great relief by just limiting some of the higher FODMAP foods. And then you've got fantastic information. You don't have to go through the complete low FODMAP diet from a traditional perspective. And then in terms of the emotional, for some people doing the traditional low FODMAP diet, it's just too overwhelming, whether it is for yourself or whether it is for the child you're caretaking. So again, the gentle approach allows you a simpler way to practically approach it, and you may end up getting all of the answers that you need with the gentle approach.
Absolutely, very well said. And that goes well with our next slide about
less overwhelming.
Yeah, you summarized it very well. So less overwhelming, as Jay's mentioned, it reduces our risk of nutritional deficiencies and supports adequate nutrition and growth. So again, you don't have to compromise your child's growth. With the traditional low FODMAP diet, your child can grow beautifully. It's just a matter of monitoring and making sure that you're replacing what you're reducing. And it is less restrictive and reduces unnecessary food restriction, and it reduces the risk of food fears and a negative relationship with food. And as Dede mentioned, I think a really huge piece of the FODMAP gentle diet is the psychosocial benefits. So even, for example, the social gatherings, which is a really big question I get a lot, and going out to eat and eating with friends and birthday parties, there would be a lot less stress with the FODMAP gentle diet because it is less restrictive. So your child might not feel like they're missing out as much.
And we saw in the poll that most of the people here are dealing with older teens and preteens, and that's the age group that where the social stuff is really important.
Absolutely. So I think that's one of the biggest benefits, especially for a teenager. It's really important and makes it a lot more manageable. And I think the compliance is also better, and it works really, really well for children and teens, especially just as a first place to try. And sometimes what we'll do is start with a gentle diet, and if it's really not working or we're not seeing benefits, you could always do a bit of a transition to a more traditional diet, low FODMAP diet if it's appropriate. And that covers all that we were going to talk about today about the gentle low FODMAP diet and gentle approaches to IBS for children. So thank you so much for all that are listening and stayed with us. So very open to answering any more questions and discussing.
It was also really interesting to me to see in the poll that a lot of people are dealing, a lot of the caregivers or parents are dealing with IBS themselves, or other family members are, as well as the children. That's certainly the case for me. I have 3 kids. Unfortunately, 2 of my kids got my IBS, so we're a family that have approached the diet together. But I think that that's not unusual. So I think what's helpful when we do polls like this is that people can see that they're not alone in their experiences. So there's a lot of you that are dealing with it yourself. There's a lot of you who are dealing with teenagers, and those teenagers probably have a lot to say about what they like and don't like in terms of food. So, these are all the things that Julia is going to address in her program, helping you get strategies to best approach that. I was also thinking when we were talking about the plate and, the question about what if you have a kid that doesn't eat any vegetables or fruit, like, I don't know why I thought of this, but I was thinking, what if you introduce an exotic fruit that maybe they've never seen before? I mean, I think that most kids or most adults who see a dragon fruit for the first time are just like, whoa, what is that? But here you have an example of something that has a relatively low to no FODMAPs. Perhaps they would try it, because it's new, it's different. People get in their heads, I don't like tomatoes or whatever it is, but if it's something brand new, maybe they would try it.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. And I do like to frame the low FODMAP diet changes as an opportunity for all of us. And like you mentioned, JD, sometimes families are doing it together. So even as a family, to challenge yourself to try new foods like dragon fruit or other low FODMAP foods that you're looking at and you might not have ever tried, which I think is a wonderful idea.
Well, we do have one more poll, and let's put that up. And any questions you may have, you can still put up in the chat. We will get to them. We would love to know how you heard about this webinar. It helps us to plan future webinars. So if you can take a look at that. We have some other questions for you as well. What age group in your private practice, what are you mostly seeing? Families coming in with what?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say most commonly actually quite younger children. Like I would say from 4 to 8 is a really big group that I see, and teenagers is a really big group. So I say between those 2 groups, I see a lot, and it is really surprising. More recently, I've been seeing a lot of younger children who are presenting like IBS, which is really, even the 4 I think is pretty young. So usually younger children or the older teenagers. I love working with teenagers.
So we have a question. Is there a good place to search for a dietitian with IBS experience? We have a global directory on our site, Mimi. It's under resources. And there are dietitians who are Monash University trained that will be designated in their profile. Because obviously, like any medical professional, you have to find the one that works for you. right? So if you have children, you want someone who specializes in pediatric, like Julia. If you are also diabetic, if you are also an endurance athlete, I mean, there's all kinds of things that we bring to the table that are unique, and there is a dietitian out there for you that can help you. So the directory is a great place to start, but you know, like any medical professional, you'll have to do your research, interview people. Certainly, Robin put the link there. And let's see, what do we have here? Most of you are signed up for our newsletter already, I guess. You found out about it that way. So we have just a few more minutes. So talk a little bit again about how what are people going to get? If they sign up for your program, what is that going to look like?
Yes, so with the program, it's the information on the learning part is self-directed. So you'll get lots of modules from me going step by step through all the background information that you need to know or your child needs to know to feel empowered, and also all the strategies and action steps. The other big piece that I forgot to mention about the program that I think is the biggest benefit is support. So every other week, you'll have a group call with myself to ask questions and to talk to one another about your experience. And like you mentioned, Day, not feeling alone. So feeling really supported in this very small private community. And then we'll also have a chat and little forum available that is completely private that you can also write in and talk to each other and myself throughout the program. So you can go through the program, I would say self-directed, but you'll have support through the program by myself as well.
Well, and this is so great because look at the poll. So 43% have said you want better informed healthcare professionals. So here you have Julia. You would be able to get one-on-one communication. You want, and it says here, easy to understand and follow guidance. She's worked out this program in a way where it's going to be very easy to understand, and she will be there for you to answer any questions. So, you know, we assume that people who attended today do have a child in their life who is suffering. They don't have to be. We know that you as the caregivers need support as well. Julia understands that. So certainly looking into the program, we would highly suggest that you do so. Excellent. Let me just see if we have any more questions. Yep, Robin's putting a bunch of links up there. And again, this is going to be, it was recorded. We will have it on our YouTube channel. You will be able to access it again, so you can take time and look at the slides, listen to Julia explain things again, and we all have time to sign up for her program. This has been great. I was dealing with IBS my whole life. You know, I think when I'm older, you know, and in my day, it was just like, oh, the kid has a tummy ache. You know, we were kind of told to suck it up. There weren't resources and tools like we have now. So this is fantastic that you've developed this, because there's obviously a need. I mean, the percentages that you said in the beginning, I mean, it's pretty intense.
Absolutely, I know. And I think the really optimistic thing is, so even in the last few years, how much has changed and all the research that comes out, and we're always evolving and learning, because it is like, I think we've come a long way even today in treating and caring for people with IBS.
We have. Well, we're about to sign off. I just want to tell everyone, you know, the goal of our dietitians and the goal of the diet is to get you to a place where you are symptom-free and where you have a positive relationship with food. So there is light at the end of the tunnel, we promise. Well, thank you so much, Julia. This has been great. Thank you for everyone attending. We will follow up with all of you, and have a great day.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone. Bye.